My name is Lou Katzos, and I'm the president of EMBCA, the Eastern Mediterranean Business Culture Alliance. And we're an organization that started a year ago, or approximately a year. We've had some fantastic events during that year, some of them business events, some of them cultural events. For example, our last event was the East Mediterranean Harlem Blues Concert, which was extremely well attended. We've had some various development, design, and construction events at the Russian Tea Room that were also very well attended. And tonight we are having our last event of the year, an exciting event that correlates or links to the UN Global Compact Leadership Summit, which is taking place on June 22nd and June 23rd. So we're doing it a day before this event, before the summit, and our topic is going to relate to that. It's going to be a business and peace topic, and it's the name of the topic is From the Bronze Age to the Digital Age: How Commerce Affects Peace in the Eastern Mediterranean. We're very excited by the topic. We have an excellent panel that you'll see in this video, and a great moderator who has done a lot of work in the area of business and peace. He's a professor from the Dubai area, the American University of Sharjah, where he is a professor of business law and ethics. And he has written a lot about the topic of business and peace. He's published on the topic, and he's going to have a panel that's going to relate to how to do business and relate to peace in conflict zones. The panel moderator will be John Katzos, an assistant professor of business ethics and law from the American University of Sharjah. Our panelists are going to be George Khalaf, executive director of the Empathy Fund. We're going to have Alice Laufer, the chief executive officer of CTG Global. Michelle Breslauer, the Director of Programs for the Institute of Economics and Peace. And Professor Alexander Kitroff, who is an Associate Professor of History at Haverford College. So I hope you enjoy the evening. We're here at the 3 West Club, where we typically have our sort of cultural type of events. So enjoy.
Hi, my name is John Fodiatis. I'm an architect based here in New York, but I'm also the vice president of EMBCA, which is the East Mediterranean Business and Culture Alliance. And this is an organization that Lou Katzos and I put together some time ago. We thought there was an opportunity to bring people that have an ethnic root in the Eastern Mediterranean that are based here in New York, doing all kinds of business and various activities. And we thought, why not introduce the idea of business and culture and rekindle those ideas the way they worked in antiquity, whether it was the Byzantine Empire or other empires. So we began about a year ago. We've had a number of very interesting events, both business and cultural, and the turnout has been great. We're building momentum. We're getting a lot of interest.
John Katzos. Tonight we're going to talk about how businesses can enhance peace in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is important because we need to talk to business leaders about how they can help the conflict situation in the region, but we also need to help people understand the historical context in which the region has operated for thousands of years. Peace and commerce have gone together for tens of thousands of years in the region. We want to highlight that, but also make clear that there's still an impact that we can have today.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming tonight. Lou Katzos, the president of EMBCA, the East Mediterranean Business Culture Alliance. One of the founders, another one of the founders is sitting there, John, my compatriot, John Fodiatis. We're an organization that hasn't been in existence that long. We just decided to form it in September. But regardless, from September to now, we've had 5 different events. All of them the type of events that we like to think cause people to think. And this evening is one of those type of events. So some of the events that we do are cultural events, and some of the events are business events. The business events tend to be related to the development, design, and construction community that both John and I come from. But we also come from the cultural side of not only the Hellenic world, but the East Mediterranean world. And so we've had, in the first year, events that relate to art. For example, we supported and sponsored an art exhibition at the Hellenic Republic Consulate Office, which had to do with, Greek artists came and had an exhibit called Yaya, Tell Me Your Story, or Grandmother, Tell Me Your Story, which related to Greek immigration. And the painter from Athens basically had grandmothers from various parts of Greece, all the parts of Greece, in their native costumes. So that was basically the exhibit. We've had also some heady type things relating to war and peace, and actually more war in the Middle East, called The Empire Strikes Back. We've had some other events that related to construction that were more on the side of the, what do we call it, the cave, the allegory of the cave. So we like to have things that are slightly different. We also had a musical event which combined the Harlem blues and the East Mediterranean blues all in the same place, which was pretty spectacular. We had that at St. Peter's. Some of you attended that event. This particular event is of tremendous interest to us because it combines the type of things that we do. It certainly relates to culture, but it also relates to business. And the East Mediterranean, okay, and the fact that we have an East Mediterranean business and peace type panel discussion is quite exciting. In the East Mediterranean, we share a lot of different things. Many of you know me from the Hellenic American Chamber, but I wanted to start this organization with John because a lot of the events that we do are multi-ethnic, multicultural, and we didn't want to be basically insular to a particular nation, but in fact, we wanted to relate to an area that, just like this panel discussion where we talk about from the Bronze Age to the Digital Age, an area that from the Bronze Age to the Digital Age, all of us shared certain commonalities of culture, commonalities of dealing with each other in business. So I'm going to stop talking now and just introduce the moderator. John Katzos is a professor at the American University at Sharjah. He holds degrees both in business and law. He is a lawyer, and he teaches business law and ethics at the university. He has done a lot of research on this particular topic, and he's a perfect moderator, and in fact has published in business and peace context. John?
Thank you. So he forgot the most important part, which is I'm also his son. If you couldn't tell the resemblance.
That's not why we're here.
That's not why I'm here. So thank you everybody for coming today. This conversation, and I really want it to be a conversation, is something that's old but also very new. Regionally, and I think my father kicked it off very well, regionally we've been having this sort of conversation for thousands of years. So from a historical perspective, we've had every empire that we've had come through the region, every group of people you know about, whether it's the Phoenicians and the Mycenaeans, or Alexander the Great to the Roman Empire to the Ottoman Empire. Conflict and trade came together. These are things that you would talk about synonymously. And that's why it's important for this particular region. What I'd like to do today is introduce the panelists to you one at a time and honestly engage in a conversation. As we go forward, if you do have questions, keep them in your mind. I'll take some time at the end if you do have questions. But I want this to be as much of an open forum as it can be. So I'm going to start with Michelle. Michelle Breslauer is the Director of Programs at the Institute for Economics and Peace. And I want to start with you mostly because the Institute for Economics and Peace comes out every year with the Global Peace Index. The Global Peace Index just came out a few weeks ago. So I was hoping you could give us all sort of a sense of how we're doing globally in terms of conflict, but then this region particularly, how is it doing in the context of the world?
Thank you. So first First of all, thanks for having me here tonight. I'm happy to just give an update on what the 10th edition of the Global Peace Index showed this year. And I also wanted to include some of the work we're doing around the costs of violence containment, because I thought that would be particularly good to set the stage for this conversation and to think about what the role is, or the potential role even of the private sector in terms of conflict management, prevention, and peace building. So what we've seen, the Global Peace Index for the last 10 years has put out an annual measure of violence across 163 countries. What we're looking at is what is the absence of violence or fear of violence around the world. So we're taking 23 different measures into account. We're looking at everything internally, from incarceration rates, policing, violent crime, homicides, to ongoing conflicts, deaths from external conflict, engagement in a civil war, to militarization, what's the nuclear capability, weapons exports. And the aim is to try to take a very complex and multidimensional idea such as peace and put a number around it. So what are we seeing now? The world is becoming less peaceful, perhaps unsurprisingly. Yes, if we look back over 1,500 years, over millennia, we are in a more peaceful place right now. But if we look over the last 10 years that we've been measuring it through the Global Peace Index, the world is becoming less peaceful, and this last year's decline of just over 0.5% is the largest decline of the last 6 years. The Middle East and North Africa as a region has been the primary driver of this decline. So what we're seeing is that even within this global deterioration, there's a larger inequality in peace. We see that countries in Europe actually are reaching historic highs, while Middle East and North Africa is reaching historic lows. And so that means that there's a widening gap between the most and least peaceful countries in the world. And that tends to have implications around cycles of violence or cycles of resilience that are actually really important for political stability. So what are the trends that are really driving that decline? Clearly we see that the civil war in Syria has caused an extreme amount of displacement. The UN released its newest figures, I think yesterday was World Refugee Day, saying that displaced people around the world now have reached 65 million. That's larger than after World War II. We're seeing 60% of the Syrian population displaced, either within Syria itself, and that used to be 0.1% in 2007, from 0.1 to almost 65%, either displaced within the country or leaving the country. And for this discussion, in particular the region that we're talking about, that displacement and that migration is having massively destabilizing effects, not just on economies, but on the social cohesion of surrounding countries that are absorbing refugees. And it poses the question of what do you do when you have this massive wave of people. Terrorism is at a high. More people died from terrorism in 2014, 9 times more than in the year 2000. So we're seeing these internal conflicts, violent extremism, terrorism, displacement driving the global trends. Battle deaths are at a 25-year high from internal conflicts. And now all of these issues go across borders, and I think that's the big point here, is it doesn't matter if something's happening within a national border, it starts to have a spillover effect. And when we look at the costs of all of this, those are tremendous. We take into account 16 different dimensions of violence containment, so trying to add up to the best of our ability, well, what are we spending not only on preventing or containing violence, but dealing with the consequences of it, the cost of homicides, the cost of incarceration, security spending, military. And we see that the cost globally for 2015 was $13.6 trillion. and that's equivalent to just over 13% of world GDP. It's 11 times foreign direct investment. And that kind of spending is fundamentally unproductive. So while we need to spend on some forms of violent containment, to have such a dramatic cost is not actually investing in the more productive, economically productive areas such as education that we could be spending on. I'm not going to go into too many figures around this because I want to leave that for questions and let other people comment, but just to give you an idea, direct refugee and internal displacement costs were $12 billion in 2007 globally. That's risen to almost $91 billion in 2015. And this has primarily been driven by the Syrian civil war. If we look at taking these costings by country and trying to understand how much of a country's GDP is spent on violence containment, what's the economic impact, we see that in the region that we're talking about today, it can range from Greece, 6%, Lebanon, 8%, Turkey, 10%, we include Syria, 54%. So there is a massive difference, but a significant costs. And those costs also have spillover effects. So I just wanted to point out that from 2012 to 2014, the real GDP growth in Lebanon was reduced by almost 3% per year because of the Syrian civil war. And the total fiscal cost of the Syrian civil war to Lebanon is over $5 billion, primarily due to the cost of migration and refugees. So what we see is that conflicts globalize, internal conflicts spill over. We're seeing further instability as a result of these demographic pressures, of these economic pressures. More and more governments are faced with reducing their foreign spending budgets to put the money back into domestic spending in order to deal with absorbing so many more people. But what are they investing in? Are they investing in more peace-building structures? Are they investing in more violence containment industries? Trying to make that those decisions is really important right now. How do we build the structures that allow for more non-violent conflict resolution in countries that are absorbing more and more people? And how do we start to shift to investing in more conflict prevention and peace building in the areas that are experiencing tremendous amounts of internal conflict, instead of just looking for militarized solutions, which have not proven to be effective either socially or economically. And this leaves a huge space for the private sector and for entrepreneurs now, who are also given a tremendous amount of technological capability to try to go across borders. And I open that up also for discussion with the group. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Michelle, for giving us an overview. I want to shift, if I can, to Professor Alexander Kitroff from Haverford College and ask you, historically, how does the current situation compare? I know that's a big question. And let's start off with that. Let's see where you go.
Well, you can always count on a historian to find something that was much worse in the past. So in a sense, I'm here to cheer you up after Michelle's documented and data-driven and very interesting examination of what's going on. So we can always go in the past and we find moments which look much worse to us. And we extrapolate not a naive sense that things are getting better, but you can identify certain areas which have stabilized and don't seem to be slipping back into that. July 1st is coming up. That's the 100th anniversary of the first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. That was a battle where on the first day, 58,000 British soldiers died on that one day. It was at the time, it was a world record. That's not to say that Western Europe is not stabilized, but from a long historical point of view, we look at that region and we say it's overcome at least those moments of strife. When the Middle East will do that, though, is up for discussion.
And it seems difficult to make that sort of extrapolation based on how bad it is now, but it also seems difficult based historically to say, well, these are people who have worked very well together in the past, but who also have a history of very nasty violence.
Well, I remember, in the 1990s when the Balkans blew up, and the thing that everyone was saying was ancient ethnic hatreds. I was at Harvard late 80s. I wanted to teach a Balkans course, and I couldn't find books because no one was writing, no one was thinking about the Balkans. There was nothing to show the students. And then suddenly the Balkans blow up, and then all the books come out and say, here's the interpretation of the Balkans, ancient ethnic hatreds. Meanwhile, before, no one was talking about those because they had been stability. So you've got that play.
So it sounds like you're bullish as to the potential. If things are to calm down, you think that things could go back in some sense to where they were stability-wise.
Yes, and the way I would do it would be by trying to direct people's attention to the non-ethnic hatred moments in the history of these countries. And in the Mediterranean, I think you've got a long legacy of what is known as cosmopolitanism. This is one of the areas of the world which has shown the greatest instance of a tolerance of other religions, other peoples, in the name of commons. I was involved in a documentary on what is present-day Izmir, Smyrna for the Greeks in the audience, and it was on the destruction of the city, and we described it as the destruction of a cosmopolitan city, because it was a cosmopolitan city. It had Greeks, it had Armenians, it had Jews, it had Turks, Muslims, Christians, and it was a flourishing commercial center, and it was lost because of the rise of nationalism. We got into trouble in Greece, of course, because, it's a Greek city. No, it wasn't. Yeah, the Greeks were maybe the biggest ethnic group. That doesn't make it a Greek city. It was a cosmopolitan city. Smyrna, Alexandria. Oops.
You bring to mind a parallel between the Balkans, Tito falling and the whole thing going to hell, and Assad and the Arab Spring, the dictators, the strongmen falling, and all of those countries going.
With a Balkan, yes. That that wouldn't mean that it's good to have dictators.
I'm just drawing the parallel.
Any other questions from the
Well, you've done a lot of work on diaspora communities as well, and I think that might be also instructive on this refugee crisis. Do you think there's a space for a reemergence of that kind of cosmopolitanism with such a large number of refugees coming out of particularly Syria?
Yes, and the thing is with the refugees, those refugees flows were repeated after the destruction of Smyrna. And, I always think of that when we see the refugees going across to Lesbos. And in 1923, the ethnic Greeks who lived across the other side of the Mediterranean in the city of Ayvalik, in Turkish Ayvali in Greek, were expelled. They went over to Lesbos, and then at night they could look over the water and they could see the lights of their home city. These paths that people have taken, they've been taken before. Lesbos has seen refugees in anguish and hardship, and within 10, 15 years, these refugees were integrated somewhere else.
And is integration the answer? Because sometimes what we hear is hold them and then send them back when things get better. Is that the answer? What's the solution, or what's been the historical paradigm?
Well, I think the tricky thing with the ethnic Greeks who were expelled from Turkey, there was a decision that Turkey wanted to become a one ethnic Turkey for the Turks, That was the decision they took, for better or for worse. So those people could not go back. And in a sense, mainland Greece had to integrate them. But they were foreigners in what was the putative homeland, and they had 2 decades of difficulty and discrimination and hardship, and were eventually integrated. And it was of huge benefit to Greece, economically, culturally, every single way.
So the benefits, if you're advising, say, the German government, the benefits are long-term. So the accruals will be in spades, but not for decades, if you're giving it them a historical
Yes,
parallel.
and I would do the type of kind of data-driven analysis to show the contribution of refugees to homelands and where they've been sent.
So I'd like to move to George Kalaf, who is the executive director of the Empathy Fund, but formerly was the head of Middle East North Africa at Synergos. And I'd like to ask you, before I ask you about your personal experiences, you've done a lot of work on social entrepreneurship in this region. And so piggybacking off of what Michelle has said and what Professor Kitroff has said, these governments are really not capable of providing full services, many of them. Where is that space for the private sector to come in and fill the governance gap in these countries?
Right. Thanks, John, and thanks for inviting me. Before I answer that, Professor, just stream of consciousness, Professor had mentioned something about cosmopolitanism that really that reminded me of my home country of Beirut, Lebanon, and sort of you used the word destruction of a city. So, I was born in Beirut when the war started, and I witnessed my city being destroyed. And when I think about cosmopolitanism and the role urban planners have in post-war reconstruction, it's remarkable. So, in Beirut, you had a predominantly Christian East Beirut and a predominantly Muslim West Beirut, and you had what was called then the Central Business District that divided those 2 sides. And in the Central Business District is where Sunnis, Shiites, Maronites, and Druze could come together and transcend those sectarian differences and form an overarching, elusive national identity. And during the war, the first battleground that was destroyed, and that it became known as the Green Line, because from an aerial view, there was just shrubbery there, was this Central Business District, where those different sects could come together and be Lebanese. They weren't any less Sunni or Shiite or Maronite or Druze, but they were also Lebanese. And so, in a way, that cosmopolitanism was destroyed, and you had the social geography of the country becoming transformed, where you had your self-sufficient Sunni quarter, Shiite quarter, Maronite quarter, Druze quarter, with their playgrounds and schools and courtyards and whatever the case may be. So it was really balkanized. And from a military standpoint, it helped because I, as a military planner, could point to a certain part of the map in Beirut during the worst time of violence and be certain that everyone I kill or maim, if I hit that area, will be the other, whatever the other is. And they could equally retaliate and have the same assurances. And from a personal standpoint, whenever you feel threatened, your natural instinct is a survival instinct of turning inward to those who you feel most comfortable with, which is your tribe, which is your religion. So the natural survival mechanisms during time of conflict, what enables survival during times of conflict is precisely what disables post-war harmony and reconstruction. And I see that cycle being played out repeatedly, this sort of sense of, at a very personal level, religion was never important to me, but suddenly during the war in Lebanon, I was more Christian. I started to go to church. My grandparents put up crosses. It's like, where was this? And then, after the war, we were told to reach out to a larger, national identity that was never there during the hardest times of conflict. So I think it's interesting, and I didn't mean to go on a tangent, but it's a conversation, and what you said about cosmopolitanism really struck a chord with me in terms of sort of Lebanon and Beirut, and the way the city was transformed during violence, and that dynamic between, mixing and sort of the inclination when you're hurt to turn inward, and how that interplays with like reconstruction and thinking about peace.
Do you see, in your experience in the last decade or so, do you see businesses or at least social entrepreneurs trying to bridge that gap and trying to create identities, or is it really just, as I mentioned, right, filling those governance gaps?
I see, at least, you know, with the social entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs I worked with when I was at Synergos, many of them were stepping in to fill in voids in terms of services that you would typically expect from the public sector, but they weren't being offered, whether it's garbage collection, whether it's, you know, innovative education, whether it's environment, whatever it may be. And the government sort of stayed on the sidelines, but when these entrepreneurs reached a certain level of scale, then the government would start to see them as a threat. And then suddenly they would sort of impose themselves or feel like that, you know, this entrepreneur who's scaling up is starting to be competition. And then you see sort of more government intervention, if you will.
So with specific reference to Lebanon, do you see the business community coming back and having that sort of integration and creating a Lebanese identity, or is that something that's still a long ways off?
Depends what day you ask.
Okay.
Overall, I will say that when I was working at Synergos, we were trying to engage with the business community, not only in Lebanon, but in the entire region, to get them excited about entrepreneurship and the potential entrepreneurship represents. And when I say business community, there was business, and then there was sort of also like philanthropists. And there's a learning curve. I mean, I felt like, not to be crass, but you know, too many of these philanthropists and businesses were interested in building the next tallest building, the next like gilded tower, the next fastest elevator, the next tallest fountain, whatever it is, and getting them to think about investing in the future and investing in the next generation and the human capital was a steeper learning curve than I had expected.
Well, so I'd like to turn to Alice. Alice is the CEO of CTG Global, and she does work in some of the most difficult areas in the world. In your work in this region, especially in your work in Palestine, how do you do business? So how do you operate? How do you just go about your day? You know, pay people and monitor them, make sure they're doing their work appropriately, make sure people are getting the things they're supposed to be getting.
Actually, Palestine's a good example because this week we had a problem. In Gaza, we have a couple of projects in Gaza, humanitarian projects, working with the United Nations. And our country manager and the week prior, one of our operations directors were refused entry. Now, I don't know if anyone knows Gaza here, but you have a very complicated border crossing at Erez, which has, first of all, is an Israeli check, then a Palestinian Authority check, and then finally a Hamas check when you get the other side. And actually they got stopped because their paperwork wasn't the correct paperwork. Well, it's the same paperwork we've been using for the last 2 years. So there is a fundamental desire for international people not to go into Gaza. And it can cause huge operational problems when you're actually trying to run a project there. So how do we do it? We actually spend a huge amount of preparation time before we go into, when we start operations in any challenging country, and they're called challenging countries because they're actually very difficult to operate there. We spend a huge amount of time building our local networks, finding people to work for us who we trust, ensuring we have complete understanding of the local laws, employment laws, taxation laws, and most of all making sure that we know how to look after our staff because we are responsible for their duty of care when they're there, and we're hiring international staff and national staff to work in these countries. So we have to trust the people that we are working with, and that takes a long time to do. And I think you see a lot of businesses, or you see some international companies going into these countries with the best intentions and probably a contract before they've actually worked out how they're actually going to operate there. Now, this circumstance that we had where we had 2 of our directors who couldn't get into country, there were very important meetings happening, there were very important events happening over the last few weeks. It still ran because we have some really, really good local local staff that we trust, and it's capable of running without the international management to be there. So that's just one example of how operating in these challenging environments can actually be very challenging at times.
And so, George, to go back to you, how does that compare with an entrepreneur's experience? I mean, you're obviously dealing with local folks, so you're bringing the expertise as the international player. How does that compare?
Yeah, no, I mean, the entrepreneur, I mean, I think all the studies that we've looked at in our experience, the ecosystem in these countries to support social entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs is quite poor. You know, so even just if you think about the level of risk needed to become an entrepreneur, the tolerance and the acceptance of risk as a sort of seeing failure as a necessary sort of step to figuring it out. Like there's a zero failure policy in some of these countries. So you know it makes it very hard to start endeavors and to sort of take that risk. And I also found that a lot of the entrepreneurs we work with, the social entrepreneurs, had a deep sense of loneliness. Like they're bucking a trend, they're often leaving more stable jobs or trying to create something new, and there isn't that sort of peer group of support for them. So, but yeah, everything from the access to capital to the social cultural issues are challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I was just, one thing that I think that we see across communities that have been impacted by conflict, anecdotally, is that there's a tremendous amount of resilience that people don't take into account. So, in many communities in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, you have communities of women who are tremendously resilient, who have become stronger and stronger because they've been in the face of conflict. And very often, the private sector can become even more resilient in countries. And so Lebanon's actually an interesting example because despite many years of warfare, the Lebanese private sector has stayed resilient. Lebanon, Beirut's party scene has existed and existed. And I actually looked it up quickly before I came, thinking like, oh, I wonder, what's going on with Beirut's party scene, which is the party capitals. Everybody's still partying despite all the conflict that's happening and the instability that's happening. Unfortunately, I saw, well, because of restrictions amongst people from the Gulf, that there's capitals not flowing, visitors aren't coming, and the clubs and bars and restaurants are starting to be impacted severely in Beirut, which is disappointing. But what I also saw was this article, which was in the Times today. Fallujah restaurant is reborn in Baghdad, offering nostalgia with its kebab. And the whole article and the accompanying photographs were all about this amazing kebab restaurant that everybody knew, from American soldiers to the ISIS members in Fallujah, which had been bombed out multiple times, rebuilt. Now, the owners have moved it, they're alive, they want to continue their business, and they've moved their restaurant to Baghdad, and people world over who've been to Iraq talk about this kebab as like the best Iraqi kebab they've ever had, and they have a thriving business where all these different people who are killing each other on the street are going to eat. I'm not giving this example because I'm trying to suggest that we can all come together in a peace and harmony through our kebab kind of way, but because what it shows is a certain resilience of people who are trying to keep their livelihoods, keep their businesses running, feed their families. It shows that in areas that we may, in our public consciousness and from abroad, see as completely fraught with conflict, there are areas of opportunity, there are people living their lives, there are capacities there that need to actually be strengthened and leveraged when we talk about investments in conflict mitigation, because they're there, and it's not just about how do we come in assuming that we're starting from a zero place or completely blown out scenario.
And just to react to that too, interestingly, to support what you're saying, Michelle, when we ran our competitions for entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs throughout the Middle East, we consistently got the sort of most innovative applications from conflict zones. Because in a way, sort of, if you're growing up in Lebanon or Palestine, you're not used to getting anything from the system. So you wake up in the morning and you develop plan A, and plan A doesn't work, you're naturally thinking, what's plan B, what's plan C? So you have to be an entrepreneur and you have to think on your feet. And in a way, growing up in that environment of adversity and sort of forces that way of thinking. Yeah.
So this resilience connects. Okay, so Izmir is maybe a bad example because it was the actual city was destroyed. But if a city has ceased to be cosmopolitan, this resilience could revive that spirit. Because when we think of cosmopolitanism, sometimes we idealize it as something that's going to be above ethnic groups, and that's wrong. People have their own identities and their own ethnic groups, but the way that they interact with the others is what defines cosmopolitanism. I mean, your story is fascinating. The family went back to the basics and affirmed that identity, but I think when there's no need for that, when there's no outside pressure, and when there is the resilience and possibly the incentive of business success, then the cosmopolitan grows out of the circumstances. It's not just an idea. People don't sign on, as you know, and say, okay, I'll be a cosmopolitan. No, you arrive at that through a process, which may be one that's being regenerated. Again, I'm thinking longer term.
But what it sounds like is, at least based on what all of you are saying, is that cosmopolitanism is generated partly by necessity in trade. So you have to engage in certain types of business, you have to deal with the other side. And I wonder how the Lebanese example plays out if you become so balkanized that you become self-sufficient. If you're still able to reach across and say, well, look, the Sunnis are really good at making X. I need to go to them for that thing. Is that still the case, or have people just become so self-sufficient post-Civil War that they don't need each other?
No, there are pockets of that. I mean, one social entrepreneur who comes to mind that we've worked with is Kamal Zoa in Lebanon. And he's developed a farmer's market in downtown Beirut where he brings farmers from around the country, Sunnis, Shias, Ministry, all of them, to once a week downtown Beirut where they have access to a consumer base that they otherwise wouldn't have in rural areas. Now, what he's really doing is a farmer's market isn't anything innovative, and you have farmer's markets all over the world, but in the context of Lebanon, what he's doing is he's bringing people together to sell their products. He's not saying, let's come together and talk about reconciliation and peace and differences, but they're coming together for a common purpose. And in so doing, week after week after week after week, you're breaking down some walls somehow.
And you're competing with
And
each
you're
other.
competing.
You're competing. It's not like
Competition.
you're not being,
Yeah.
happy-go-lucky and high-fiving each other. You're
The
competing.
Druze guys are the best at the pomegranate juice. Everybody knows that. So you go to them for the pomegranate juice. This is just, yeah.
So you got your pomegranate,
Yeah,
tomato
exactly.
guy. Alice, you look like you wanted to. No.
No, I was just actually thinking about the whole entrepreneurism, because actually Lebanon's an interesting country because Lebanon does not actually get the aid funding that quite a lot of the other countries in the region get. And actually you become very reliant upon entrepreneurism to actually rehabilitate and for the country to recover from something like that, as opposed to somewhere like Syria, for example, where there's a whole city that's being built in Gaziantep for the international aid agencies all sitting there waiting to go into Syria, and they're building their propel, they're preparing themselves to actually go in, and it's going to be very different because you're going to have a lot of private sector businesses who will be recipients of probably government funding to go in, and the UN is obviously very ready to go, and actually that's one thing the UN has really recently become aware of is that the private sector, pretty much the Ebola crisis was this sort of real push to push them over the edge to realise that actually the private sector is a very, very, very important part in the recovery and rehabilitation and also the emergency response in any country. not just from a funding perspective, which is what they used to think the private sector was for. They've actually realised that the private sector can act quicker. We're more efficient. Our speed is definitely faster. We don't have political loopholes to have to get through and red tape. And we can actually, in some circumstances, do it better. And but it was very interesting, the thinking of Lebanon, because it's not really somewhere that we do a lot of work in or around, because the funding is just simply not there compared to some of the other countries.
So we have about, I'll give us one last question and we'll open it up for questions for everybody else. If you had a prediction on the next 5 years, if you were giving a business who wanted to go into this region advice, they said, look, we want to be in this region, we want to enter it in the next 5 years. Yes, no, or maybe?
It's a little bit of a risk analysis there that I'm not sure I can entirely give, but there are a lot of places, if you're talking about this region, there's a lot of diversity and difference and variation, and that should be taken into account. We're not talking about one static situation. So, you can get greater returns on your investment in a riskier place, or faster returns in a riskier place. But you're looking for longer term stability, maybe identify which countries seem to have a level of political stability, openness, that will keep a certain amount of social cohesion. I mean, the big issue is that, do societies have the structures and the attitudes and the institutions to handle the shocks that they are going to face inevitably? Whether it's a flood, a hurricane, resource deprivation, a coup, financial crisis, all of a sudden an influx of migrants, a neighboring conflict spillover, one of those shocks is going to happen. And is it going to lead to some sort of maybe civil resistance that's nonviolent, or is it going to lead to violent demonstrations, political instability, and then a cycle of conflict that's much more difficult to get out of once you're in? So it's really about trying to understand where there are those areas to invest, where there's a little bit more stability, both communally and at the political level.
So I would think historically of the example of the Greek diaspora in Alexandria, who in the 1930s lost some of their privileges. In the 1940s, they lost their legal privileges. In 1956, most businesses were nationalized, and then in 1963, the last round of nationalizations happened. That was when my grandfather came over to Greece, but they remained. And I went in the 1980s to do historical research, and there were these small Greek businesses who had survived because, ironically, they were too small to be caught by this kind of the succession of measures. And for me, it's just an example of how, and then of course their progress meant there was more business coming back from Greece. So I just would come up with historical examples showing how in the long term there's survival. Now whether businesses would want to get advice from a historian though,
It's a big question. I mean, there's so much diversity in the region, so it's really hard to say, but I mean, just to keep it, I mean, if I was investing with my heart, absolutely, just because I'm so personally invested in places like Lebanon, but truthfully, if I was investing with my head, I would probably stay away for the next few years.
I'm biased. So I would say yes, definitely. But I think if you are going to do it, you need to invest money into preparing yourself. You need to invest resources into making sure that you've got your grassroots networks and your local connections, and you've built your local connections, and you've got people you trust, partners that you want to work with, and the ability to look after your staff and train them on what the risks are before they go, and the local cultures and everything else. So I think you need to learn. I think there's an important learning element that the directors and those that are going to work in the environment need to go through. And actually, I mean, again, there is quite a good learning platform in the Business of Peace program, which is run by the United Nations Global Compact. And that's, you know, if people are interested, get involved with that and come along to some of the events, because you really do start to learn and actually connect with people who are working in these very challenging and high-risk countries. But I'm taking
So I'd like to open it up to questions, if there's any questions you have.
For Alice, what kind of businesses are you starting or are you working on?
So we run a lot of humanitarian projects. We do things such as food distribution in Sudan and Darfur. We do food distribution in Sierra Leone, where we were actually distributing food into the quarantine areas during the Ebola crisis. We run monitoring programs in Somalia. We're actually establishing a similar program potentially in Yemen as soon as we're ready to move in there. We run, oh gosh, all sorts of different things. Election complaints commissions in Afghanistan. We employed about 640 staff working in all 34 provinces of Afghanistan during the provincial and presidential elections. So a huge amount of different humanitarian projects.
If we compare what's happening in Middle East right now or other regions to what's happening in Germany and France right now, Central Europe have been killing each other for the past 800 years, and now it's like a tax command. Everybody's happy. In our minds, everything is stable, and it's like a model for everything else, at least for now. What is the fundamental difference? What is what the Germans and French achieved that cannot be achieved down in the Middle East? And if we think that this is a commercial union that exists right now, if this commercial union stops to exist, are we talking about people potentially getting on their arms again? This is what brings the Europeans together, and there is more into this union than we think.
I imagine that's a question directed at you, Professor Couture. You get the big ones.
The French and the Germans and maybe the British and the other Europeans are not smarter than anyone else. The way we interpret the present situation historically in those countries was that they were early developers. They were early developers historically because other parts of the world were controlled by big empires, and the big empires are the kind of slow dinosaurs of history. What happens in Europe is Europe breaks up into small units which compete against each other and are more open to change and innovation. That's why Britain has breakthroughs with whatever, Magna Carta, etc. France has its own particular state. So in the sense that we're comparing the stability, first of all, they're not, I wouldn't say quite models, and I wouldn't kind of, write off completely that there wouldn't be any tension. Surely there is. But those countries have acquired a stability and culture only thanks to the fact that they were the privileged early developers because of the historical circumstances. So by the same token, in a macro-historical view, the places like the Balkans and the Middle East, there is no reason for them not to acquire that type of stability. The problem with the Middle East specifically, and the Balkans, was the multi-ethnicity of these countries, which meant that the ethnic mix was there, and when ideas of nationalism came up, suddenly the country itself was divided up, and that delayed the type of quicker growth that the Germans and the French could have because they were more cohesive ethnically.
Yes, do you have any views, the panel, on business development in Greece at the moment? Because there is this diversity which keeps coming, despite maybe not being totally accepted, but this will contribute to some business growth, or what do you think will be that? seeking Brave New World?
Well, with Greece, and this is something that many people in the audience come in, but you know, my recent visits there, the tourist sector is doing extremely well. It's almost surreal how they've acquired a kind of professionalism and business practice. Everything works, the ferry boats, the buses, the taxis that come to pick you up, everything works incredibly well. The rest of the economy is not working well. So, you know, I think obviously tourism is a special case for Greece, but it's an example of what could happen if the conditions could be changed and the other sectors of the economy could be encouraged, and then people would have to be encouraged to invest, etc. But I may have a rosy-tinted view of Greek tourism.
Well, I wonder actually if Michelle could jump in on the tourism angle. IEP has done work on this, on how tourism can impact conflict and vice versa. What does that look like in other environments?
I mean, really what we're looking at is trying to understand sort of what are peace industries, and tourism, you know, being the number one peace industry in a way. What are the industries that actually profit more during more peaceful times than war industries or defense industries do? Tourism being number one. It's very easy for tourism to be impacted by something like rising terrorist attacks or deaths from violent extremism. I think that's something we see, for instance, in Tunisia or other places where there's been a sort of fear instilled that it's dangerous. I don't think that that's how people view Greece. I think they see it as now a cheaper, more affordable chance to go to Greece. So countries that tend to have a certain level then already of that stability or peacefulness, which Greece has and had. I mean, Greece is not a country embroiled in the middle of an open armed conflict. Countries like that, then, their tourism industry tends to be more resilient when there is certain types of conflict or violence or instability that start to touch it. In Greece, that would be economic collapse and demonstrations, and then now migration into Greece and trying to absorb that. But because already Greece was relatively peaceful, then that tourism industry has been able to not only survive, but in this context, thrive. Whereas places that are more unstable or where the threats are more immediate in a way in terms of fear, warranted or not, that you'll see the tourism industry be impacted or negatively.
Whereas it sounds like the Lebanese example, even in places where it may not be great for so long, you might still have certain types of tourism with people coming in more regularly.
That's right.
And I see Alice wanting to jump in.
Yeah, I think it's not without risk, if I may be so bold to say. I think if the government, both the Greek government and the foreign governments, don't fully support Greece with the refugee crisis and the fact that it's probably one of the largest countries being mostly affected by the crisis, that it could become a problem, and that there are potential risks that go with a lot of unemployed people, a lot of people who need to find money in somewhere or other. Crime could increase and worse. I mean, you take Kenya, for example, a country which was a massive tourist destination, people going on safaris, gorgeous beaches, and it has turned, it's terrible now. You know, they are really, really struggling. There's a lot of petty crime, gunpoint crime. I mean, staff who work for me have been held at gunpoint, 2 different staff on 2 separate occasions. You know, it becomes more dangerous, and if tourism, which is a massive source of income for a country like Greece, gets compromised, it can cause some risk.
Quickly.
Yeah, quite quickly.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, and there's 4. I don't know, pick it up. Ladies first.
Hi, I have a question. What countries if any, do you think in the Middle East, if they were broken up, or if they can be broken up in the future, like Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, do you think it would be better for peace, for internal peace in those countries, terrorism, everything, if certain countries were broken up into, let's say, tribal areas or big tribal areas? If it's possible, since a lot of them were like made-up countries.
Somalia is trying it. They seem to have 3 different countries.
I think that may be a bigger question than we're equipped to handle.
Yeah, we're attached to this idea of single nation states from whatever, Westphalia, whenever it was, centuries ago. And there's a mental jump to agree to break up a country. It did happen in the Balkans, though, and the Kosovo example is one. So it's there as a solution.
I mean, some countries are really trying it. You look at Somalia, you've got Somaliland, for example, which is much safer than South Central Somalia. You look at Kurdistan in Iraq, you know, the Kurdish government have been desperately trying to extract
Iraq is probably the closest to it.
Yeah. Whether they'll achieve it or not is a different matter.
I have a question, and that is, you think about the Eastern Mediterranean specifically, when you brought up terms like cosmopolitanism, commerce, and these are clearly positive aspects of the state or the society. In the history of the Eastern Mediterranean, it seems when those circumstances have occurred, there has been one hegemon or another that kind of dictate the overall stability. Is that really what's at play here in terms of why it's so unstable now? Is it a Shia versus a Sunni thing? Is it the impending breakup of Europe, the potential impending breakup of Europe? Is it the let's say the reconstitution of Russia as a national identity? Where do you attribute this?
Or the superpowers weakening their influence.
Or if I could rephrase your question, what are the precursors to having a successful business environment? So what are the precursors to us being able to have cosmopolitanism again, where people can engage in trade? What has to happen? I don't know who wants to pick that up. Again, big question. The audience with big question.
Alexander is smiling.
So I'm going to give you a trigger of that. I'm going to say something nice about the Ottomans. And that is, they were a hegemon, but they were a hands-off hegemon. The Ottoman Empire was decentralized because it was so big. And it allowed a great deal of local rule, and it allowed the Greeks, Armenians, and Jews especially to engage in commerce. And they almost did what they liked without central control. When the British tried to blockade the French ports during the Napoleonic Wars, Greek ships from the Ottoman Empire went over to the Western Mediterranean and ran the blockade and broke it. And there was no reaction as long as they weren't caught by the British. So, yes, the hegemon, but a type of hegemon which is a benevolent, maybe not benevolent, might be pushing it, but a hands-off one that cares less about trade.
Oh, no, so I can ask the question. Just getting back to that, what normally starts in the process is a lot of violence and the consolidation of the empire, etc. Then when the empire, what have you, is consolidated, is when in fact the peace element starts, and when in fact you have a trade, etc. And if you look at that whole area, whether it's Alexander who consolidated, first he took over different parts, consolidated, there was trade. Or you look at the Roman Empire, the so-called in the East, really the Roman Empire, but the Byzantine Empire, what we want, the Byzantine Empire, the same type of thing happened. There was peace and stability because there was a powerful country that basically quashed any rebellion or what have you. And do we see, this goes back to your question to a certain degree, do we see what is happening in the East Mediterranean relating to the lack of power or the weakness of the former Western powers' power within the area, where they sort of control the area whether it's America or the Soviet Union in the past, or whether the British or the French in different areas. Are we seeing a situation where they're sort of collapsing in their influence, and in fact, all the other elements now are rising up?
Post-Cold War breakup, and therefore no hegemons. Therefore, the mice, whatever.
And then from that, you see someone rise, take over again, various areas, and then stabilizes, and then you have, peace and commerce and all the rest of it. I'm just curious.
Maybe there has to be a new way of doing things because we are post-superpowers.
And also add sort of the democratization now of not only information, weapons. I mean, we have a lot of, we can look back at these historical trends with all of that hindsight, that right now we're facing a situation where we have such a tremendous amount of information at our fingertips at all times that it also distorts our understanding of what's going on. We can't put it in a historical context because all we see is the immediate. We see, I would say, if you asked people on the street now, they would think that their threat from terrorism or from mass shootings in the US is their number one fear. More people around the world are killed by homicides than they are in terrorist attacks. And not to say that there isn't a tremendous concentration of some of these issues, but the way that we receive information now is very different. Or our ability to commit violence and develop weapons, have a greater impact in our carnage through that is also very different now. And it can be citizen-led in a way it might not have been in the past. And I think that is something I would add to all of these issues that we're now seeing in the Eastern Mediterranean. But I'll leave all of the great predictions of superpower relations and hegemony to the professors on the panel.
Thank you so much for coming.
You can learn more about EMBCA, you can learn more about the activities we're involved with, and the events that we have planned and coming up, as well as an archive of things that we've done in the past year. And we now have a website that people can go to. It's EMBCA.com.